My name is Hope Miller, and the night I should have been happiest turned into the night that shattered everything I believed about family, love, and safety. On my wedding day, while everyone laughed and cheered, my younger sister was humiliated in front of 100 guests, all brushed off as just a harmless prank. But I didn't laugh. I stood up. I fought back. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The people who were supposed to protect me were the first to betray me. Instead of comfort, I was called dramatic, ungrateful, even a troublemaker. That was the beginning of a story I never asked for. A story that would drag me from the safety of small-town traditions into courtrooms, broken promises, and the kind of battles that leave scars you can't see. If you've ever been silenced, if you've ever been told to just let it go, then this story is for you. Stay with me, because what started as a wedding disaster became the fight of my life, a fight for justice, dignity, and the right to define my own happiness. And before we dive deeper, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your business before you do. My father worked long shifts in a garage, his hands always stained with grease, while my mother stocked shelves at the local grocery store. We didn't have much, but we had grit. As a kid, I watched my dad get cheated by customers who forgot to pay, and my mom smile through insults from people who thought a cashier wasn't worth respect. That's where I learned something early. Life doesn't hand out fairness. You either fight for it or you accept scraps. My mom used to wear a thin silver bracelet, nothing fancy, but to her, it meant strength. Before she passed, she pressed it into my hand and said, "Hope, don't let anyone else decide what happiness means for you. Make them see you, even when they'd rather look away." At the time, I thought she was just being dramatic. I was young. I believed love, marriage, and hard work would be enough to protect me. I thought if I stayed kind, life would stay kind back. But the night of my wedding showed me just how wrong I was. That silver bracelet wasn't just jewelry, it was a warning. When I married into the Evans family, I thought I was stepping into stability. Mark, my husband, was gentle, steady, the kind of man who never raised his voice. I loved him for that softness. But softness can feel a lot like weakness when storms come. His mother, Eleanor, was a different story. To her, appearances were everything. She'd say things like, "Hope, don't make a scene." A family's reputation is all it really has. What she meant was, hide the truth, even if it burns you alive. From day one, I felt like an outsider in their home. The smiles were polite but cold, the conversations filled with reminders of how I should behave as a proper wife. To Eleanor, keeping peace mattered more than keeping promises. And Mark, he loved me, I believe he did, but when lines were drawn, he rarely stood on mine. It didn't take long before I realized that marriage didn't save me. It threw me into another kind of battlefield. One where loyalty was tested and silence was demanded. And soon, I was about to face a fight that would make my wedding day look like a rehearsal for something much darker. It started with the lake. The town council announced they were selling the land around Miller's Lake, the only quiet place people had left to fish, to gather, to breathe. They said it was for development, that a luxury resort would bring jobs, money, tourists. But what they didn't say out loud was that families like mine, and dozens of others, would be forced off land we'd lived on for generations. I remember sitting in that stuffy gymnasium during the meeting, the kind where the folding chairs squeak under you and the air smells like old popcorn. Everyone nodded along as Mayor Collins spoke about progress. Everyone, except me. I raised my hand. What about fair compensation? What about the families who don't want to sell? The room went quiet, then restless. Collins gave me that politician's smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes. Miss Miller, sometimes progress requires sacrifice. I'm sure a reasonable woman like you can understand that. But I didn't understand. I didn't accept it. I stood up. My voice shook, but I made it louder. Sacrifice shouldn't mean stripping people of their homes. Progress shouldn't come at the cost of dignity, gasps. Murmurs. A few people even clapped quietly. But before I could breathe, Eleanor's voice cut through the room like a knife. Hope, sit down. You're embarrassing the family. My husband Mark tugged at my sleeve, whispering, Please, not here. But I couldn't stop. Because deep down, I knew, if I stayed silent now, I'd be silent forever. Then came the twist I didn't expect. The land wasn't going to be sold. It already had been. The contracts were signed weeks ago. The meeting wasn't about asking our opinion. It was about telling us what had already been stolen. That was the moment I felt the floor drop out from under me, because this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about truth. And the people in power had already decided that truth wasn't welcome in our town. And I knew they weren't just coming for the lake. They were coming for me. When we got home that night, the silence between us was heavier than the humid summer air. Mark didn't look at me as he set his keys down, didn't look at me as he kicked off his shoes. Finally, he said, Why do you always have to make everything harder? I stared at him. Harder? They lied to us, Mark. They stole from us. And you want me to stay quiet? He rubbed his face, exhausted. I want a life that isn't a war zone. I want to come home from work, eat dinner, watch TV, and not worry about you fighting everyone in this damn town. I felt the words cut deeper than he realized, because what he was saying wasn't just about tonight. He was saying my fight for fairness was a burden, that my voice was a problem. I whispered, So you'd rather I sit down, smile, and pretend it's fine? He didn't answer. His silence said everything. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling while Mark's breathing settled into sleep beside me. My hands clenched around the silver bracelet my mother had left me, and all I could think was, how do you share a bed with someone who can't stand beside you when the world turns against you? It wasn't the town that broke my heart that night. It wasn't the mayor, or the contracts, or the corruption. It was the realization that the man I thought would be my partner in everything might never truly be on my side, and once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. The next few days felt like walking through a fog where every shadow was whispering my name. At the diner, conversation stopped when I walked in. At the grocery store, two women by the freezer aisle muttered just loud enough for me to hear. That's the one causing trouble. Even at the post office, the clerk slid my change across the counter without looking at me, his mouth tight like my presence was an inconvenience. It wasn't just strangers. My mother-in-law Eleanor refused to speak to me at family dinner, her silence louder than any insult. And Mark? He tried to act normal, but every time I mentioned the land or the mayor, his shoulders stiffened, his jaw locked. I was becoming that woman. The one no one wanted to sit next to at church. The one parents warned their kids not to be like, not because I had done something wrong, but because I refused to stay quiet. And yet, the more they tried to freeze me out, the more determined I became. One night, I slipped into the town records office after hours, not breaking in, but staying late under the excuse of filing paperwork. My hands shook as I flipped through dusty binders and poorly kept files. That's when I found it. A folder dated 3 months before the town meeting. Inside were contracts already signed, stamped, sealed. Proof that the deal with the resort was done long before they ever pretended to ask for public input. I remember staring at the papers, my heart pounding, my fingers cold. They hadn't just stolen land. They had staged a performance to make us believe we had a choice. And if they could lie about this, what else had they buried? The next town meeting was packed, the gymnasium buzzing like a hive. Folding chairs scraped, neighbors clustered in whispers, and at the front, Mayor Collins stood with his smug, rehearsed smile. I clutched the folder so tightly my knuckles whitened. For days, I debated whether I was brave or insane for doing this. But once I walked to that microphone, once the crowd turned to me, there was no turning back. "My name is Hope Miller," I began, my voice trembling but clear. "And I have proof this council has been lying to all of you." Gasps, murmurs. I opened the folder, holding up the contracts with the bold black date, 3 months before the so-called vote. "This wasn't a choice," I said, scanning the crowd. "It was a performance. Our land was already sold before you ever asked for our opinion." The room erupted, voices shouting, chairs shifting, people craning to see. Some cheered, some scowled, but all eyes snapped to Collins. He didn't flinch. He simply leaned forward, lips curling into a predator's smile. "Miss Miller," he said smoothly, "before you accuse your leaders of fraud, perhaps you should check your own paperwork." Confusion rippled through me. "What do you mean?" Collins raised a hand, and one of his aides stepped forward with a manila envelope. He pulled out a copy of the town's property registry, where my family's name should have been attached to our land. But it wasn't there. The document showed that our property, the piece by the lake where my father taught me to fish, where my mother's ashes were scattered, was already reassigned. Not to the resort, not even to the council, but to an anonymous holding company. A cold wave crashed through me. My legs nearly buckled. Colin's voice echoed. "It seems, Miss Miller, that you no longer have a claim to the land you're so desperate to protect. Perhaps you should tend to your own affairs before interfering in others." The audience gasped, then broke into murmurs, some sympathetic, most skeptical. I could feel their eyes, not as neighbors, but as jurors deciding my fate. My hands shook as I held the folder tighter. I had walked in ready to expose a lie, and instead, they had stripped me of my own ground to stand on. In that moment, I realized this fight wasn't just political. It was personal. They weren't just silencing me. They were erasing me. After that meeting, I knew I couldn't fight them in the open anymore. They had money, power, the town's loyalty, and now they'd stolen even my family's deed. If I was going to win, I'd have to change the rules. So I started quietly. A small voice recorder slipped into my purse when I passed the mayor's office. A notebook hidden under the loose floorboard in our bedroom, filled with times, dates, overheard conversations. Every scrap mattered because one day those scraps would be all I had. I met with Lisa, the young lawyer I'd connected with in Cleveland. She taught me how to file information requests, how to demand public records they hoped no one would bother asking for. She said, "Hope, the law is slow, but paper trails don't lie. You just have to find them before they vanish." Nights blurred into each other. My kitchen. Table covered in documents and coffee cups. The silver bracelet on my wrist felt heavier than ever, as if my mother herself was watching. But the person who was watching, and not with pride, was Mark. One night he walked in on me recording notes into my phone. His face darkened. "Are you serious? After everything? After what they pulled on you at that meeting, you're still pushing this?" I set the phone down. "I can't stop now. That's what they want. If I let this go, they'll bury me. They'll bury everyone." He slammed his fist against the table, papers scattering. "You think you're saving this town, Hope? You're just dragging us through the mud. My mother won't leave the house because of you. People whisper my name like it's a curse. And for what? For some principle?" My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "It's not just a principle. It's our home. It's the truth. Mark shook his head, eyes hollow. No, it's your obsession, and it's going to destroy us. For the first time since we married, I saw it clearly. Not fear in his eyes, but resentment. Not worry for me, but shame of me. And that night, as he turned away from me in bed, I whispered into the darkness, more to myself than to him. If fighting for justice makes me alone, then alone is what I'll be. Just when I thought I was running out of air, Lisa showed up at my door. She was younger than me by a few years, sharp eyes behind simple glasses, carrying a briefcase stuffed with more papers than I'd seen in my life. "Hope," she said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "I've been digging." She spread documents across my kitchen table, maps, contracts, memos she'd pulled through public record requests. They've set up at least 3 shell companies tied back to the same developer. That's how they're hiding the land transfers. I stared at her. "Why are you helping me?" "You don't even live here." Lisa leaned forward, her voice steady. "Because what they're doing in this town isn't unique. It's happening everywhere, and most people don't fight back. But you already stood up in front of the whole town. That makes you dangerous to them, and that makes you worth backing." For the first time in weeks, I felt something break through the fog of fear. Hope. Small, but stubborn. We stayed up late, piecing timelines together, cross-checking names, writing down leads. Lisa had the legal knowledge I lacked, and I had the inside view of how this town really worked. Together, we weren't just grasping at straws anymore. We had a plan. As dawn broke, Lisa sipped her coffee and said, "You're not alone in this, Hope. Don't forget that." And for the first time since my wedding day, I believed it. Because maybe, just maybe, I finally had an ally strong enough to face the storm with me. The annual Founders' Day festival was supposed to be about pride, barbecue, smoke in the air, kids running with sticky hands, the whole town pretending we were one big family. But when I walked into the square, I felt the stares before I even saw the faces. Whispers trailed me like shadows. "That's her, the troublemaker, the one suing the town." I tried to keep my head high, the silver bracelet on my wrist catching the sunlight like a shield. Lisa walked beside me, her presence steady, but even she couldn't drown out the weight of all those eyes. Then it happened. A woman I barely knew, the mayor's cousin, maybe, staggered forward with a plastic cup of wine. Before I could react, she tossed it straight into my face. Cold liquid dripped down my chin, soaking into my dress. The crowd gasped. Then some laughed. She sneered, "Here's to the woman who thinks she's better than the rest of us." "Maybe a good splash will cool you down." My cheeks burned, but not from the wine. From humiliation. From rage. I opened my mouth to respond, but then I felt Mark's hand clamp around my arm. "Don't," he hissed, low and sharp. "Not here." "Not now." I turned to him, my eyes wide. "You're just going to let them do this?" To me? His jaw was tight, his voice trembling with anger, not at them, but at me. "If you fight back, you'll prove them right. Please, Hope, stop making this worse." The crowd watched, waiting for me to explode, to scream, to give them the show they craved. But all I could do was stand there, dripping, my husband's grip holding me in place like chains. In that moment, the betrayal cut deeper than the humiliation, because the wine would dry, the laughter would fade, but the image of my husband standing with them, not me, would never leave. Lisa handed me a napkin, her voice firm but quiet. "They want you broken. Don't give it to them." I wiped my face, lifted my chin, and walked away. Not because I was weak, but because I knew this battle wasn't meant to be won in the streets. It was meant to be won in court. And when that day came, I promised myself, no wine, no whispers, no betrayal would silence me again. Filing the lawsuit felt like setting fire to my own life. Lisa and I spent weeks preparing the documents, building a case out of scraps. Contracts with missing pages, testimonies from frightened neighbors, whispers turned into affidavits. When I signed my name on the final page, my hands shook, but not from fear, from certainty. "This will change everything," Lisa said. She was right. The very next morning, my face was plastered across the local paper. "Bitter bride sues her own town." The headline stung like a slap, painting me as a scorned woman lashing out, not someone standing up for justice. The photo they used: me mid-sentence at the town hall, eyes wide, mouth open, looked angry, unhinged. By afternoon, it spread online. Neighbors I'd known since childhood shared the article with laughing emojis. Old friends avoided my show calls. At the grocery store, a cashier muttered, "Guess you'll sue us next." But worse than strangers turning against me was watching my parents suffer. My father was cornered outside the garage by two men warning him to tell your daughter to shut up before she gets hurt. My mother's gravestone was vandalized, spray painted with the word traitor. I wanted to scream, to fight, to lash out. But Lisa reminded me, they want you to lose control. That's how they win. Still, the hardest blow didn't come from enemies. It came from the person I loved most. One evening, I came home to find Mark sitting at the kitchen table, a manila envelope in front of him. His hands trembled as he slid it across to me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice already breaking. He wouldn't look me in the eye. "Divorce papers." The room spun. My chest tightened as if all the air had been sucked out. "You're leaving me?" "Now?" Mark's eyes were glassy, his voice low. "I can't do this anymore, Hope. The town hates us. My mother won't even go outside. People at work whisper behind my back. You're tearing everything apart. And I don't have the strength to keep standing in the middle." Tears blurred my vision. "So instead of standing with me, you're walking away?" His silence was my answer. I picked up the papers, the ink swimming through my tears. After everything we'd shared, after every promise, this was how our story ended? Not with a fight for us, but with him surrendering me like a burden he was tired of carrying. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the divorce papers on one side of me, the lawsuit files on the other. Two paths, two choices. One had been ripped away from me, the other was all I had left. I slid my mother's bracelet higher on my wrist, wiped my face, and whispered into the silence, "Then I'll fight without him." Because if losing my marriage was the price of telling the truth, then so be it. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was a war. And I was done playing nice. The apartment felt emptier than ever. Mark's clothes were gone, his side of the closet bare, his toothbrush missing from the sink. Divorce papers sat on the counter like a wound that wouldn't close. For 2 days, I barely moved. I let the phone ring, let food spoil, let the silence swallow me whole. I kept asking myself, was this worth it? Was justice worth losing the person I thought I'd spend forever with? On the third night, Lisa knocked. She didn't wait for an invitation, just stepped inside and took one look at me. The shadows under my eyes, the untouched plate of food, the bracelet hanging loose on my wrist. "Hope," she said softly but firmly, "you can't let them break you." "That's what they want." I shook my head. "They already did." "I lost him, Lisa. I lost everything." She set her briefcase down with a heavy thud. "No, you still have the truth. And you still have me. We've got a hearing date. You don't need to be whole right now. You just need to stand." I looked at her, my chest tightening. "What if I can't?" Lisa leaned closer, her eyes fierce. "Then I'll hold you up until you can. But we go into that courtroom, Hope. Because if you don't fight, all of this, The lake, your family's name, your mother's bracelet, it all disappears. And so do you. Her words lit a spark in the ashes of my grief. Maybe I couldn't save my marriage, but I could still save myself. I wiped my face, pushed the papers aside, and whispered, "Okay, let's do this." Because sometimes the only way to survive is to stand taller in the ruins. The courtroom smelled of polish and old paper, the kind of scent that clung to wood-paneled walls and whispered of battles fought long before mine. Rows of benches creaked as townspeople filed in, not just curious onlookers, but neighbors, friends, people who'd grown up with me. Some wouldn't meet my eyes. Others glared openly, as if I had dragged them here myself. I sat at the plaintiff's table, Lisa at my side, her stack of files a fortress between us and the world. Across the aisle, Mayor Collins leaned back in his chair, his custom suit immaculate, his lawyer smirking like the outcome was already bought and paid for. The judge entered. The gavel cracked. The trial began. Lisa opened with a measured voice, laying out the timeline, the contract signed in secret, the shell companies hiding ownership. For a moment, I felt the room listening, tilting ever so slightly in our favor. Then Collins's lawyer stood. Tall, sharp, with a voice that dripped condescension. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we have here is not a case of corruption. It is a case of personal grievance. A scorned woman abandoned by her husband, lashing out at the community that wouldn't bend to her will." Every word felt like a knife. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay still, stay silent. He held up the newspaper, the headline screaming, "Bitter bride sues her own town." The photo of me mid-yell filled the courtroom screen. Laughter rippled through the crowd. "Is this the face of reason?" he asked. "Or the face of resentment?" My cheeks burned. I wanted to shout, to tear the paper from his hands, but Lisa's grip on my wrist grounded me. "Not yet," her eyes said. "Wait." The lawyer went on, dismantling our witnesses, twisting words, painting me as hysterical, vengeful. Even the judge frowned at times, as if doubting whether I belonged in this courtroom at all. Finally, it was my turn to testify. I rose, my palms slick against the wood railing. I spoke about the lake, about my father's fishing trips, about my mother's bracelet. I spoke about fairness, about dignity, about the right to choose. But halfway through, the lawyer interrupted. "Miss Miller, isn't it true that your own husband left you over this obsession? That your so-called fight for justice cost you the one person who promised to stand by you? Doesn't that make this less about justice and more about your inability to let go?" The words landed like blows. I faltered, my voice catching. For a moment, I saw heads nodding in the gallery, buying his version of me. Then Lisa slid a document across the table toward me. Her eyes burned with urgency. I swallowed hard, steadied myself, and held it up. "This," I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger, "is a copy of a contract signed with Riverside Holdings, 3 months before the town meeting, where we were told the vote hadn't even happened yet." Gasps rippled through the room. I flipped to the next page. "And this," I continued, "shows that Riverside Holdings is nothing more than a shell company, tied directly back to Mayor Collins's own campaign donors." Collins stiffened, the smirk slipping from his lawyer's face. "This isn't about a bitter bride," I said, louder now. "This is about leaders who thought they could sell us out and bury the truth under paperwork. But the paper trail doesn't lie, and neither do I." The courtroom erupted, some shouting, some cheering, some stunned into silence. The judge banged the gavel for order, but the tide had shifted. For the first time since this fight began, I saw fear flicker in Collins's eyes, and in that moment, I knew. The war wasn't over. But the battlefield had just changed. The courtroom hadn't settled when the doors creaked open. A man stepped in. Worn suit, nervous eyes, clutching a folder against his chest like a shield. I didn't recognize him, but Collins did. His face blanched, his hands tightening on the table. The judge frowned. "Identify yourself." The man cleared his throat. "My name is Daniel Price. I worked for the development company behind the resort deal." A ripple ran through the gallery. Collins's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." This witness was not on the docket, but the judge raised a hand. "If this man has information relevant to the case, we'll hear it." "Proceed." Daniel stepped forward, his voice unsteady but determined. "I was part of the administrative staff. I saw the contracts, the transfers, and I saw the payments, funneled through shell companies into Mayor Collins's re-election fund." Gasps exploded across the room. Collins slammed his fist on the table. "Lies! This is slander." But Daniel pressed on, pulling papers from his folder. "These are copies of the wire transfers. I kept them because I knew someday someone would need to know the truth." He held the pages high. "The mayor sold this town out for campaign cash. The resort wasn't about progress. It was about profit." His profit chaos erupted. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras flashed. People who had once sneered at me now leaned forward, eyes wide with shock. The judge pounded the gavel. "Order! Order!" Collins's lawyer scrambled, shouting objections, trying to discredit Daniel. But the damage was done. The evidence was there, in black and white, undeniable. Collins stood, red-faced, sweat beading on his forehead. "You think this means anything? You think you can take me down with the word of a disgruntled employee?" But his voice cracked. His calm, polished mask was gone. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the table, hardly daring to breathe. For months, I had fought to prove I wasn't crazy, that the system was rigged. And here, finally, was the truth, not whispered in the dark, but shouted under oath. Lisa leaned close, whispering in my ear. "This is it, Hope. The turning point." And as I looked at Collins, his fury twisting into desperation, I realized she was right. The man who had tried to erase me was being exposed piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through my bones. The judge's voice was steady, deliberate. "Based on the evidence provided, the court finds that the contracts signed with Riverside Holdings are invalid due to fraudulent concealment. Compensation must be renegotiated at fair market value for all affected residents. Furthermore, the court orders an investigation into financial misconduct linked to Mayor Collins." For a heartbeat, silence. And then the room erupted. Some cheered, others shouted in disbelief. Reporters rushed for the door to get their stories out first. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the table so tightly the wood pressed deep into my palms. We'd won. Lisa squeezed my arm, her smile breaking through the storm. "You did it, Hope. You really did it." But the truth was more complicated, because as the crowd roared, I felt a hollowness in my chest. This wasn't victory like I'd imagined it. There were no parades, no sudden rush of joy, just exhaustion. Just the knowledge that the battle was over, but the war was not. Neighbors who once glared at me now looked with wide eyes, some even nodding with respect. Yet others turned away, scowling, unwilling to forgive me for dragging their comfortable silence into the light. As Collins was led out of the courtroom, his face pale, his eyes burning with a hatred that promised this wasn't the last I'd see of him, I realized something important. Winning doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like survival. When I stepped outside, the sun was brighter than it had been in months. Reporters shoved microphones at me, voices overlapping. "How do you feel? What's next?" I paused, touching the silver bracelet on my wrist. My mother's words echoed. Don't let anyone else decide what happiness means for you. I took a deep breath. This isn't just about me, I said. It's about every person who's ever been told to stay quiet when they knew something was wrong. Today, we proved that truth still matters. And tomorrow, we'll keep proving it. The cameras clicked. The questions kept flying. But for the first time, I didn't feel erased. I felt seen. And maybe that was the real victory. The fallout came fast. Within a week, Mayor Collins announced his resignation, though everyone knew it wasn't voluntary. The state launched a full investigation into his campaign finances, and whispers spread that indictments were coming. The development company pulled out of the project entirely, their polished executives vanishing back to the city, leaving only broken promises in their wake. On paper, it was justice. On the evening news, it was a victory. Headlines flashed, corruption exposed in small-town land deal. For once, my name wasn't a punchline, but a warning to anyone who thought they could bury the truth. But on the streets of my town, the story wasn't so simple. Some people nodded at me with newfound respect, even gratitude. A man I'd never spoken to before pressed my hand in the grocery store and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." Those moments lit a small flame in my chest. Yet just as many turned away, their eyes cold. At church, entire pews shifted to avoid sitting near me. Parents tugged their children closer when I walked by, as if fighting for fairness was contagious. Eleanor, my ex-mother-in-law, crossed the street when she saw me, her lips pressed tight, her gaze full of blame. I had exposed the rot. But to some, I hadn't saved the town. I'd shamed it. Justice had a price. And even though Collins was gone, I could still feel the cracks he left behind in every sideways glance, every whispered insult. Victory wasn't clean. It never is. But as I walked home that night, the silver bracelet warm against my skin, I told myself, at least now, when they look at me, they see the truth. After the trial, people expected me to disappear, to fade into the background, lick my wounds, and let the town stitch itself back together without me. But I couldn't. Because once you've seen how power works in the shadows, you can't unsee it. So I moved back to Cleveland. I found a small office space above a laundromat, peeling paint, buzzing fluorescent light, a rent I could barely afford. I bought a secondhand desk and hung my mother's silver bracelet in a frame on the wall, not as jewelry anymore, but as a promise. Lisa joined me as my partner. Together, we started offering free consultations to low-income families, people being bullied by landlords, workers denied wages, women too afraid to speak up against harassment, cases most lawyers wouldn't touch because there wasn't enough money in them. The first client was a single mom whose landlord tried to evict her illegally. She sat across from me, her hands trembling as she slid a crumpled notice across the desk. "I don't know where else to go," she whispered. I smiled, steady and certain in a way I hadn't felt in months. "You came to the right place." Word spread, slowly. At first, we barely kept the lights on, but then, more people started walking through that door. Janitors, waitresses, factory workers, people who'd been told their voices didn't matter. Each time I saw pieces of myself in them. The fear, the anger, the exhaustion of being dismissed. And each time I reminded them, and myself, that silence is what keeps the powerful strong. We didn't win every case, but every time we stood up, every time we forced someone to answer for their actions, it felt like planting a seed in rocky ground. Some nights I'd lock the office late, step into the quiet street, and feel the ache of everything I'd lost. My marriage, my place in the town I once called home. But then I'd think of the woman who walked away from court with her children still under her roof. Or the factory worker who finally got the paycheck he'd been denied. And I realized, maybe this was my new family, not bound by blood or vows, but by a shared refusal to be silenced. It was late one evening when I heard the knock. Slow, hesitant, almost ashamed. When I opened the office door, Mark stood there. His hair was longer, his shoulders slumped, his eyes carrying the weight of a man who'd aged years in months. "Hope," he said quietly. "Can we talk?" We sat across from each other at the same desk where I'd counseled so many strangers. Except this time, it was the man I had once promised forever. "I came to say I'm sorry," he began, his voice cracking. "I should have stood with you. I should have believed in you. I thought keeping the peace was the same as protecting us, but all I did was abandon you when you needed me most." For a moment, I felt the old ache, the memory of nights we dreamed about a future that would never come. Part of me wanted to reach across the desk, to close the distance. But then I thought of every moment he'd chosen silence over truth. Every time he let me stand alone in the fire. I folded my hands. "I don't hate you, Mark. I never did. But I can't go back. That chapter's over." His eyes glistened, but he nodded. "I understand." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of what we'd lost heavy between us. Then he stood, gave me one last look, and walked out. As the door closed, I touched the bracelet on my wrist. It didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt steady. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't defined by who stood beside me, but by how I stood on my own. When I look back now, it feels like I've lived two lives. The first was the life I thought I was supposed to have. The quiet marriage, the small-town stability, the promise that if I just behaved and stayed silent, everything would be fine. That life ended the night of my wedding, not because of one cruel prank, but because I finally saw what silence really costs. The second life is this one, the harder one, the lonelier one, sometimes, but also the life where I finally understood what my mother meant when she pressed this bracelet into my hand. Don't let anyone else decide what happiness means for you. I lost my marriage. I lost friends. I lost the place I once called home. But in losing all of that, I found something I never had before: my own voice. And here's what I've learned. Happiness isn't the absence of conflict. It isn't keeping everyone comfortable while you drown inside. Real happiness comes when you stand up, even shaking, even scared, and say, "No more. Not like this." Maybe you've been told to stay quiet. Maybe you've been made to feel small, inconvenient, disposable. I know what that feels like. But I also know your voice matters more than you think, because the moment you decide not to be erased, you've already won something no one can take away. These days, my office is rarely quiet. The phone rings constantly. A tenant fighting eviction, a worker denied his paycheck, a woman terrified to speak up against the man who signs her contract. Every story feels different, but underneath, they all ask the same question: does my voice matter? And every time, I answer the same way: yes. More than you know. The other night, I locked up late. The street outside was empty, the neon laundromat sign buzzing above me. I paused at the window, looking at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. Not the bride in white, not the wife begging for peace, but someone tougher. Scarred, maybe, but unbroken. I touched the bracelet on my wrist. It didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a torch. And that's when it hit me. Happiness was never about what I lost. It was about what I found in the ashes: a voice, a purpose, a fight worth carrying. If you've ever felt erased, if you've ever been told you're too much, or too loud, or making things worse, remember this: the world changes because of people who refuse to sit down. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Because there are more stories out there, stories like yours, stories like mine, that deserve to be heard.